to item 11, I think we're up to. And this is, I need to move an extension of time until the business of the agenda is complete. Councillor Cooper, second. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. Getting very loose now, Councillor Coombe. Now, item 11 is at 425 on our agenda, and this is to approve the strategic direction to guide the development of a draft future development strategy. So now, reporting on this, I've got Jacques Victor, GM of Auckland Plan Strategy and Research, Dawn Mackay, and Dawn is Manager of Growth, and Claire Gray. These motions are moved by Councillor Dalton. Do I have a second, please? Councillor, can I take Councillor Bartley, please, who's been working on this? Thank you, Councillor Alfilipona. I will definitely take Councillor Bartley. Thank you, Councillor Filipina. And I think I'm going to hand to Jacques Victor initially. Jacques, you with us?
Tēnā koutou. Thank you, Chair. No, I'm going to hand directly over to Claire.
Kia ora, Claire.
Kia ora koutou. So this report seeks your approval for the strategic direction to guide the future development strategy, a draft of the future development strategy. The report's in two main parts. So the first part looks at the strategic direction, and that's in the form of 9 principles. And then the second part looks at some of the more detailed content that we hope to use to develop the draft over the next few months through to the end of this year. So I'll cover off the first part and then hand over to Dawn to go through the more detailed work. Next slide, please. So this is really a reminder of why we're here. We have a development strategy in the current Auckland plan, but for various reasons it needs updating. And one of the main reasons it needs updating is because the MPSUD tells us we need to, and it sets a time frame for us to do that. So in time to inform the next long-term plan in 2024. This is another requirement under the MPSUD, but this time it relates to long-term strategic planning. And there are a couple of other requirements up there that I have put up. So taking into account the principles of te tiriti, so that wording is taken from the MPSUD itself. And I'll just jump down to including a clear statement of hapu and iwi values and aspirations for urban development. So I'll touch a bit on that again in a moment, but again, that wording comes from the MPSUD. We also need to show in this work how we will achieve a well-functioning urban environment. So that will link back to what you're just discussing in terms of changes to the regional policy statement, but we, in the future development strategy, will also need to show broadly how we will achieve that in Auckland. And a key one here is making sure that Auckland has enough capacity for homes and jobs over the short, medium and long term. So I'll come back to that in a moment as well. But firstly, just to say that the future development strategy is really about setting that strategic spatial direction for Auckland, and implementation is through mechanisms such as the Auckland Unitary Plan and the long-term plan. So next slide. So the kind of primary objective of the MPSUD is really around enabling sufficient capacity. And as we've heard, for Auckland, it's highly unlikely that capacity will be an issue for us. So therefore, the focus of the future development strategy is on the quality aspects. So if we think about what we can do to direct growth or to focus growth in good areas for intensification, we need to think about the levers that we still have available to us to help us direct that growth. And one of those levers is where we fund or do not fund infrastructure to support that growth. So that's really what that middle blue box there is about. We can't afford to provide infrastructure to all of the locations when we have dispersed growth. And then finally, on the side there, we have what it means for thinking about what it means for each of those three main areas in Auckland. So the existing urban area, the future urban, and the rural. And Dawn will go through those areas in a bit more detail in a moment. On the next slide, that's really looking at the proposed strategic direction. And this is what we're asking for approval for today. So it's shown here as 9 key principles. So I'll just take you through them. The first one is about Maori values and aspirations. And before, you might have picked up that on the slide about the MPS requirements, it was hapu and iwi values and aspirations for urban development. But we're saying that all of Tamaki Maori values and aspirations are important here, and so we will also be speaking to Mātāwaka and other Māori organisations, like housing organisations, for example, to gather those values and aspirations. The next 2 there are about how and where we grow. So focusing growth around centres, nodes and corridors in areas with good access to public transport. Also, for the future urban areas, reconsidering some of those areas. So that's potentially pulling back on some of the future urban areas that the council's showing at the moment. And also avoiding expansion into rural areas, avoiding urban expansion into the rural areas. The next one there is about the quality aspects, and that's of both the built and the natural environment. So that's included as something to really emphasise in this work, particularly because with intensification that becomes even more important. The next 2, they focus on the environmental aspects and climate change. So protecting and enhancing the natural environment, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, avoiding locations that are impacted by climate change. And those are also some of the reasons that we might be re-looking at some of the future urban areas. Making the best use of existing and planned infrastructure. And I've already talked about the importance of focusing on that, using that as one of the levers, as a way that we can help direct growth into the locations that we think are most appropriate. In terms of business and employment, we've got a focus on identifying the key economic places. So getting a really good understanding of what we have now, what the trends are and what might be needed in the future. And finally, protecting the soils. So that relates to both the environment and the economy, or the rural economy. So together, all of these 9 principles really provide the kind of high-level strategic direction that we're proposing for the update, or for us to go away and develop a draft future development strategy. And also, just the final thing on this slide is those yellow boxes across the bottom. So these are sort of fundamental aspects or cross-cutting themes that are important to consider across the future development strategy as a whole. And they work as a package along with these 9 principles that form the strategic direction. So I'll just hand over to Dawn, who will talk in a bit more detail about the 3 main spatial areas on the next slide.
Kia ora, tātou. Thanks, Claire. And I'm just going to take you through 3 slides which look at that more detailed level of planning that we are going to do to back up the work around the strategic principles and also the evidence base that we've developed so far. So the work we're doing is across 3 topics, 3 spatial topics of existing urban, future urban and rural. And just looking at that existing urban work stream at the moment, as Claire's already pointed out in the strategic principles, it's about what can we do to actually focus development into areas where we understand and can make best use of the existing and planned infrastructure. What can we do to look at employment and housing opportunities and outcomes? And that's particularly looking at mixed use, which might give us some of those advantages in terms of reducing VKT, for instance, and having people close to where they can both work and access their day-to-day needs. And this work really leads us to understanding what our priorities might be, which we can then look at how we implement through mechanisms such as the LTP process, which starts soon. It'll probably start next year and then has to be adopted in 2024. Thanks, Kalinda. Can I get the next slide, which is about future urban, which is the next spatial area. And it's probably the one where we've had significant pressure over the 4 years since the last Auckland plan, and that's the current Auckland plan and future development strategy, was adopted. And during this time, there's been significant private plan changes that have brought forward live zoning for future urban areas. And that's really looking at putting pressure on our ability to service these areas with infrastructure. And there's a growing funding gap, which is a significant issue for council. So the work that we want to do around this looks at what can we do about consolidating and coordinating development, what tools have we got, what the council has said we don't want to do extensions out into the rural areas. We want to look at some of these future urban areas, particularly in terms of climate change emissions and the new legislation that's coming on stream, and also the natural hazards and climate change risks that we know are there. So what is the new information that we've also got? So we want to do more work around this to actually understand the outcomes for future urban and the role it plays in growth and how that fits together with the existing urban area, because none of these areas can be considered in isolation. You still need to look at how they fit together. And then the final slide, if you can just move to that, please. Thank you. The final slide is about rural. And we've looked at rural in our current future development strategy in terms of rural productivity, growth, and the rural environment. The NPSUD and the review of the future development strategy doesn't really highlight rural issues, but it does ask us to look at constraints in a region-wide analysis. And so we are doing that work, but we're also looking at understanding, what is the role of the rural area in terms of rural productivity? What are the settlements and the lifestyle properties and the opportunities in those areas? And that's within the perspective of limited growth as part of the overall package. And also, what are the effects on the rural environment of development and the activities that happen in those areas? So looking at biodiversity, highly productive land, and also back to natural hazards again. So there is that 70% of our land area is within the rural area, and this future development strategy, we probably haven't said it, but yes, the emphasis is on NPSUD requirements, but we also are updating the development strategy as part of the Auckland plan. So that nests within that work. It's one document that will provide both of those requirements. And then the last slide is questions. But before we go into that, I was just going to say that the timetable for this work, what we're looking to do is get a draft developed by the end of the year so that we can come back to the new council early next year to confirm the draft document for consultation in that first period of 2023, and then go out, consultation in that first period, and then adoption about mid-2023, so that it can be a piece of the strategic input to the LTP ahead of that 2024 deadline. Thank you. That's the presentation. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dawn, and thank you, Claire. I have a question from member Karen Wilson. Kia ora, Karen.
Kia ora, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation. It's always really great talking about future infrastructure when on the back of what we've just finished for the day, we've been talking about everything being rushed, so I appreciate very much the topic. Look, all I really wanted to ask, because I understand there is a comprehensive engagement process that's going to be put in train, but I noticed in the presentation that the Te Tiriti o Waitangi reference was about hapu and iwi, and then generally you start talking about, in terms of the strategic direction you're seeking some guidance on, it referred to Māori generally. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the MPSUD and what this is intending to do, how that translated from iwi hapu, which makes a huge difference as you'll be aware, into to Māori generally.
Claire.
Through you, Chair. So we did bring, as you mentioned, Member Wilson, we did bring a engagement approach for Māori to our future development strategy steering group, and also the planning committee workshop. And the direction that we got through that was to take a broad approach and to include mātāwaka, as well as information that we could gather from Māori organisations that might help inform what those values and aspirations are across Tamaki Makaurau. We obviously do have to comply with the MPSUD, so we do need to frame some of what we're presenting in our future development strategy as a statement of hapu and iwi values and aspirations for urban development that will need to be included in there so that we are satisfying the MPSUD requirements. I guess what we're saying is that we're also taking a broader approach.
Just a supplementary,
Absolutely.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
The notion of changing the MPSUD as it refers to treaty and iwi hapu, and then referencing it as generally all Māori, if I can be helpful, needs to be teased through, because the iwi hapu are mana whenua and generally Māori are not, and there's an engagement program being built around that. I think if guidance can be sought through the Secretariat to ensure it is adhering to the principles of the MPSUD and a commonality around what's considered iwi hapu and what's considered generally Māori might be useful, and could also go to my next part, if I can, Mr. Chair, which was how are you identifying that you're covering in sufficient definition mātāwaka. So it is quite difficult. How are you canvassing whether you're actually have mātāwaka representation and feedback for this plan?
Through you, Chair.
Clear.
Thank you. Yes, that has been something that we've discussed in those workshops that we've had, and I guess the challenge to us was to do a good job around the mātāwaka engagement space. So we have an independent consultant working with us to help us engage with mātāwaka. She has some existing connections already. We've also had some contact with Te Puni Kōkiri, who are happy to help in that space as well. So we're still building up our engagement approach for mātāwaka, but our challenge that we've accepted is to do a thorough approach there and reach as many mātāwaka as we can. Also acknowledging that there are often, it's not always that there are organisations to represent people. There may be individual people that are quite hard to reach. So it's a challenge.
Yes, it is.
I don't have a straight answer, sorry.
No. There's no right or wrong answer, really, to be fair. I was just ensuring that there's continuity in terms of how it's translated through NPSUD, and if there was some guidance that's required, I'm confident the IMSB Secretariat may aid you in that sense. And then just pointing to the engagement plan, the first part needs to be done well in the first instance, is really just trying to provide some guidance.
Kia ora.
Thank you, Member Wilson, and thank you, Claire. I'll now go to Glenn Wilcox.
Yes, thank you. My question is based on the rural strategy and the rural kaupapa, and how are we connecting with Maori landowners? I think it's accepted that most Maori land in Auckland, besides pre-settlement, is actually held by Maori landowners outside of the treaty settlement. So can I have some idea as to how we're connecting with them?
So, kia ora, through the chair, that work will also happen as part, so there's part of it will happen through the rural work, but the other part will definitely happen through the work that Claire is doing, trying to engage across the board in terms of hapu, iwi and mātāwaka. So we want to do that hapu and iwi and mātāwaka engagement as thoroughly as we can, and I think there is opportunity through that process to be able to look at those issues.
Yeah, can I have a supplementary to that? So, Chair, and my question is still, how are we connecting with Maori landowners who have their own act under Te Ture Whenua, which is not a treaty-based act, but is still an act? And so how are we connecting with those people?
Claire or...
One would have to come back through Chair. We'd have to come back and with a particular answer on that question. So I think we're still investigating, you know, what the bounds of the databases and the contacts and organisations that we've managed to make contact with through the work we're doing as part of the Maori engagement section. So I think we would have to come back and provide some more detail for you to be perhaps satisfied with the approach.
Yeah, but I'd just say, you sure can find us quickly when it's race time.
Thank you, Member Wilcox. Okay, so that's future work, and both Claire and Dawn will come back to you, Member Wilcox, about how we're going to tackle that particular part of the engagement with Maori landowners. Thank you very much. There are no further questions. So comments on this? Councillor Dalton is the mover.
Really, just to add what Claire and Dawn have said, is the strategies that we've been working on in the past couple of years that also inform. So Te Taruki, Tāwhiri, the water strategy, the current transport emission reduction plan, and of course everything that we've talked about today, which informs it. But in addition to that, just to acknowledge the steering group that is also helping to inform officers of the work that they're doing, and the terms of reference have the Mayor, and because we're moving in past this particular term, the Chair and Deputy Chair of Planning, the Chair and Deputy Chair of the Environment and Climate Change Committee, the Chair of Regulatory, the Chair of the Rural Advisory Panel, member of the Transport Emissions Reference Group, and Chair of the IMSB have all been working alongside officers to get to where we are today. But other than that, it's a good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dalton. Deputy Mayor Cashmore, please.
Yes, thanks. And I'd just like to note the work that the team has been doing on this. It's an important piece of work. And I'd also like to acknowledge particularly the rural aspects of it, Mr Chair, simply because there is a huge degree of pressure facing rural for people wanting to move to quasi-rural areas which are currently largely being desensitised for rural production by the reverse sensitivity aspects of countryside living. And these are currently often zoned at the moment mixed rural, rural coastal and so forth. And bearing in mind that we've got the Biodiversity Act, we've got then the climate change initiatives and forestry challenges, but also growing more indigenous biodiversity on farms. And we are, as a council, during the unitary plan, encourage that by the use of transferable titles. And if that is all going to succeed, this is all going to be knitted together with the availability of countryside living areas to sustain the growth of those biodiversity offsets for the benefit of the environment and the sustainability of rural, but also for those people who want to move out of town and into rural environments. Those people often now working from home. They might be semi-retired or fully retired, and we need to have a good hard look at what we're doing there. It's not just all about city living. There's a lot of people who actually really want that rural lifestyle and appreciate what it can give them, and we just need to ensure that people are catered for to the best manner possible. We don't just exclude it for the sake of a very targeted and theoretical idea of urbanisation. So thanks very much, and I really appreciate the staff's openness for the conversations that we've had. And I think you're coming to Rural Advisory Panel tomorrow, and there'll be a further quite a informed discussion around that, I imagine, tomorrow afternoon. So thanks very much, team.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor. And look, I just probably want to you can read it, of course. The principle 3, where we're reconsidering the development of urban expansion into those rural areas that the Deputy Mayor has just referred to. We often forget that 70% of the Auckland that we're responsible for is rural, but we're all thinking and living our lives mostly in the urban areas. But it is actually the rural where we want to find our relief from city life. That's where, you know, the great spaces are and large. It's where a lot of the recreation is. But it is also where the rural production is, and that's a significant contributor to not just the GDP of Auckland, but the GDP of the nation. It's also the food basket of Auckland and the nation, and particularly if you go to the south of Auckland, you know, very productive lands that have, you can run, I think, Deputy Mayor, you can run 2 to 3 crops in some of that land down there. It is very, very fertile. And we've been losing it. It's been going, and once it's gone forever. It's irreplaceable. And that rural area is the blue and green breathing space for Aucklanders as well. It has a host of functions. Now, when you look at the land economist work that's in the Section 32 supporting the National Policy Statement work we've been doing, it's looking like we've got provision for housing and business growth in the future going forward a long, long way. So there's a very strong possibility that we do not have to keep expanding into these really valuable, productive rural lands. So as we get into these principles and we dig down into them, the direction might change quite dramatically. And I think it is looking really good for Auckland if we change that dramatically. It'll be looking good for urban Aucklanders and be looking good for rural Aucklanders. So I look forward to that particular principle unfolding and the work that the team are doing on that. So thank you. So thank you, Claire, for leading that with Dawn and Jacques and the other team. And thanks to the group that has been shaping this up into this form, but we've got a long way to go. Of course, we'll hear back at the next council. So there's been no further speakers. We'll put that to the vote. All those in favour say aye.
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 Contrary, no, and declare that carried. That's another unanimous carry. And we'll go to, quiet down, please, Councillor Kuhn.